You're listening to the eighth module in the Online International Security Program. Today we'll be talking about peace and nation building, the last element of peace support operations. Now, peace building is the most difficult part. It's also the longest part of any peace support operation. It's the portion of the operation that begins once the war ends, once the conflict ends, and both sides have agreed to abide by the terms of the agreement with no significant dissent among various factions and splinter groups. But just because you have this peace doesn't mean that the conditions that led to the conflict in the first place have been solved. And with this in mind, peace building focuses on alleviating and changing the conditions that lead to conflicts in the first place. We've seen examples of permanent peacekeeping missions in Cyprus, and we've seen that those are problematic, that they're expensive, they don't solve the underlying problems, and they're just not practical in terms of having the United Nations and other security organizations deploy troops indefinitely, trying to keep two conflicting sides apart. So how do we move beyond simple peacekeeping and peace imposition and create permanent peace that lasts without the application or threat of application of military force? In other words, how do states and organizations create permanent, long-lasting stability that doesn't threaten the larger international security community? Indeed, we can look at some places around the world and observe that the problem in these areas, in these regions, wasn't so much the ability to end hostilities, but to make that temporary stability last and transform into a permanent stability. Think about Somalia, where there have been any number of cases where the application of military force has temporarily ended what was a bad situation. But that lull in the fighting, that lull in the conflict was never really made permanent. Even today, there's a struggle to create a state there that can genuinely assert law and order, and not have the international community have to come in every time there's a flare-up of conflict. In other parts of the world, you have ethnic and religious divides that prevent a permanent peace from taking hold. And the challenge here is to create institutions that somehow all ethnic and religious and racial sides recognize as being legitimate, that they recognize and see in their interest in participating in, and thus the temptation to slip back into armed conflict is not as great. And of course, you have genuine humanitarian concerns when a stable state or an effective state exists, but the state targets certain groups, certain minority groups, thus creating humanitarian crises that may trigger foreign intervention. How do you ensure that once that intervention takes place and those humanitarian concerns are alleviated, you don't leave a state in place, a government in place that's going to cause those humanitarian concerns to reemerge? So what do we need to create this long-term stability? How do we build a lasting peace? We have to do a couple of things. First, we need to create a common set of values that all the feuding parties will embrace. And here the experience is that you generally want to promote things like democracy, human rights, and basic civil and political liberties. So that's why democracy is seen as very important in a conflict zone, because democracy is the only form of government that at least attempts to give everyone a say in how the state is ruled. Whether it's a genuine democracy where all the people get to vote is less important as simply creating a government where everyone has a stake in the success of that government. Secondly, you need to create institutions that are seen as legitimate on all sides, that are built upon these core values that we just talked about. And finally, that the decisions made by the institutions are binding and have consequences for the daily life of everyone within the nation. that they aren't merely figurehead institutions or symbolic institutions that make decisions that don't have an impact in the day-to-day lives of people in the various territories and provinces in the conflict zone. Because if they don't have that kind of power, then what's the point of building them in the first place? We can define peace building as all those efforts required on the way to create a sustainable peace zone. And the word zone here is important because sometimes when you're having more than one state in conflict, you're not just trying to create peace in one particular state, but a group of states, a region of the world, where there might be one or more state in existence. So you want to aim rather ambitious, both geographically and materially, in trying to create a zone of stability and peace. This requires a vision, a future that all parties involved see as being peaceful, where they don't see conflict as a way of solving their disputes or realizing their interests, of honestly assessing what's required in terms of material needs. As we'll see here in a moment, one of the challenges to peace building and creating stable peace is economic. So are there sufficient economic opportunities? Is there sufficient opportunities for wealth generation that will create stability and peace in the future and not slip back into subsistence and depravity, which, is exacerbator of conflict, political conflict? And then, creating a plan that is coherent and stands a good chance of actually being realized. Being ambitious is important, but we don't want to be unrealistic. There's certain parts of the world where perfect democracy is simply not going to come about. And in those situations, maybe you want to have more realistic and pragmatic goals. A place like Afghanistan is not going to be a model democracy anytime soon. So if you're trying to build a permanent peace there, maybe you don't try to create an American style or European style democracy there. Maybe it's enough to have some kind of more authoritarian system where all the parties have a place in how the state is governed, but isn't, a model of parliamentary democracy where every party has proportional representation of some kind. Who does peace building? The easy answer here is basically all the institutions and actors we've already seen. We see dominant hegemonic states do peace building. And indeed, peace building, as we'll talk about towards the end of this talk here, is perhaps an extension of the old colonial system, where you had imperial states trying to create stability in what they saw as savage and undeveloped lands, trying to civilize them, trying to create what they referred to and understood as civilized institutions. They would deploy military force and social services and educational resources in order to establish a permanent, lasting peace in the image of the dominant metropolitan state. More recently, obviously, we see security communities do peace building. NATO, again, is an example of this. In Afghanistan, NATO has primarily served as a peace building institution, trying to create permanent peace in Afghanistan in support of the larger effort to create a formal Afghan government that's not subject to Taliban rule or Taliban influence. IGOs like the UN obviously are involved in peace building a great deal. And NGOs turn out to be very important when we're talking about peace building because they do a lot of the civil society work. They do a lot of the material work in terms of getting food and medicine and other material supplies distributed to populations and communities that might be ignored by the other groups listed above. Because peace building is a more complicated procedure, we can break it down to several different dimensions. One is the political dimension that focuses obviously on the governmental and judicial aspects of trying to make a peace permanent. You have the security dimension, which is going to focus on law and order, and the economic dimension, which is about generating wealth and economic opportunity in areas where there hasn't been a lot of economic development. So looking at the political dimension here, we're talking about, again, a push towards some kind of democratic governance. Again, it may not be a perfect democracy, it may not be a American-style democracy, but some kind of government that allows all the major factions to participate in the government. Oftentimes, this will create tension. One of the challenges of any democracy is to mitigate and balance tensions of various social groups. So you want to create institutions that attempt to balance and mitigate the tensions that emerge between different actors, and also the tensions that exist between the peace builders, who are usually foreign or outsider, and the local actors, who oftentimes will resent being lectured to or dictated to about what the proper form of government is, or when they feel like their local norms and cultural values aren't being properly honored by the peace building operators. And oftentimes democracy is problematic because it doesn't deliver the result you want. We see a little bit of this back in 2009 when Iraq basically kicked the United States out of the country after an election where the government, the Maliki government, largely won that election by promising to do just that thing, to kick the United States out of Iraq and no longer have the United States as a significant presence in Iraqi society and in the day-to-day life of Iraqi government. And that was problematic because in the power vacuum that was left by the American departure, the spaces for the growth of groups like ISIS are opened up. And much of the challenge with ISIS today comes about as a result of the Iraqis perhaps being a little too eager to kick the United States out of Iraq. It's not to say that it's the Iraqis' fault that ISIS exists, but among many mistakes that were made, beginning with the invasion of Iraq in the first place, kicking and having the United States leave Iraq too soon had some negative consequences. The security dimension focuses on establishing the rule of law. And here we're talking about police, courts, jails, and any other aspect of a criminal justice system that is very important to create legitimacy among the governmental institutions. The problem here, of course, is that creating security requires armed force. And in a society where you've had factions warring with each other, the question is who comprises this armed force that establishes law and order? Will those who have been subject to the humanitarian atrocities committed by one group tolerate members of that same group putting on police uniforms and being armed in the street and trying to maintain objective law and order, given that history? And just beyond policing, can you set up a legal system that is free and independent of the old reputations and problems and violations of the old legal system? Again, think of Iraq here, where you had a judicial system that was largely seen as being corrupt and punitive against those who were the enemies of Saddam's regime. Do those people who are victims of this judicial system trust a new one that's set up by the United States, by foreigners who may or may not be working with political figures that were attached to the old regime? It's not clear. And this is a challenge that's still not fully worked out in terms of trying to figure out how you get factions and groups to trust institutions that in the past were known for corruption and violence. And then you have the economic dimension of peace building, which is arguably one of the more challenging and long-lasting efforts of peace building because it takes a while for economic policies to take hold. The first step of this is to end the poverty that often exists in areas of deep conflict. How do you create economic institutions and policies that don't result in the large majority of people having to struggle through abject poverty. Secondly, you need to create growth. You need to generate wealth. You need to create some kind of consumer society where there's enough money and people can earn enough money working to not just be able to afford basic food and shelter, but to actually purchase consumer items and other accoutrements of a middle class society. We have pretty good evidence historically that when you generate middle class levels of income and wealth, that has a real soothing effect in terms of alleviating and mitigating conflict, political and social and other forms of conflict. And finally, you have distribution, where you need to ensure that the wealth that's generated doesn't go to one person or to a small group of people. That programs exist to ensure that the wealth that's generated gets distributed in equitable fashion. This doesn't mean communism necessarily, but it does mean that those who historically, for whatever reason, political, social, religious, whatever, who have not experienced a lot of wealth, have programs in place that see that a substantial amount of income is directed towards them. This can be acquired through taxes and redistribution or through incentives to generate wealth through entrepreneurship and small business generation in these communities. But somehow distribution has to take place equally across all of society. How effective has peace building been? We don't have a lot of examples because peace building is by its nature a very long-term process. But we have some examples. I mentioned empires already. They're not the best example because usually those efforts at creating stable societies was again done in the name of exploitation, in the name of exploiting economic resources, in the name of trying to pacify and civilize what we're seeing as racially inferior populations. And so this isn't the best example to reach towards. Perhaps a better one is the post-World War II world, where you have the United States in the aftermath of World War II and the devastation, especially in Europe, implement a series of policies designed to rebuild those countries and societies devastated by war. So think about the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was an attempt to provide an abundance of material and monetary resources to countries that the United States and the Allies were just a few months before still engaged in a rather intense struggle with. The provision of providing low interest loans and benefits packages to Germany, to Japan, to other states in Europe, on the belief that as soon as these countries recover, once you set up stable institutions and create an economic wealth, they'll want to rejoin the economic community and the international community more broadly speaking. And that's exactly what happened, at least with Germany and Japan. It's interesting to note that the Marshall Plan was offered to the Soviet Union, but they rejected it because it was seen as the first step towards the United States being, or excuse me, the Soviet Union being subsumed to the capitalist Americans. Beyond the Marshall Plan, you have the Bretton Woods institutions, which was the World Bank, the GATT, which eventually became the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund. And again, these were institutions set up to sort of make the economic recovery that took place after World War II more permanent, and not lose whatever gains were made by the Marshall Plan, which was designed to be fairly short term. Alongside these economic and social provisions was the presence of American military power in bases and in naval capability around the world to sort of back up these less tangible measures with more material force. The UN has done peacekeeping peace building in a host of countries. I'll mention three here, then three fairly successful examples. Cambodia in 1991, in the wake of the collapse of the Khmer Rouge regime. El Salvador in the early 90s, in the wake of a very brutal and violent civil war that took place there. in the 1980s, and as we mentioned in a previous module, Sudan after the genocide that took place there in 2004. Iraq, however, provides a very stark reminder that peace building can go wrong. And it's hard to point to one specific example of, or one crucial moment when things that could have gone well in Iraq started to go bad. It's a series of poor decisions, perhaps even beginning with the decision to invade in the first place. But the hope here was that once you changed the regime and toppled Saddam, you could, with a significant amount of effort, create a stable democratic country that could be a model for other efforts in the same vein. Unfortunately, once Saddam was toppled, relatively quickly we have intense civil conflict breaking out between ethnic groups and religious identification groups. This creates a period of instability for several years until, towards the end of the Bush presidency, a surge of troops, along with a new package of reforms and a new strategy with regards to dealing with internecine conflict, was applied. It showed some signs of success, but then, of course, you had a combination of Obama pledging to get out of Iraq as soon as possible, and the Iraqis, under the Maliki government, demanding the United States leave as soon as possible. And the full weight and full possibility and potentiality of those rebuilding efforts was never fully realized. And as I've already mentioned, once you remove the substantial American military presence, you create spaces for other more nefarious forces to take hold. In this case, ISIS, which filled the power vacuum in Iraq once the United States left. Of course, many will argue that the problem with the American recovery effort was that it was a selfish neo-imperialist project from the beginning, and that in many respects it should be observed in the tradition of Western imperialism, that peace building is just a more softer way of talking about countries that invade and that control other countries in the name of exploitation, trying to put a friendlier face on what is in fact a very problematic relationship. And again, if you look at Iraq, there are many strong accountings of the American experience in Iraq that follow this particular line. I believe one of the extra credit projects is to watch the video Losing Iraq, and which explores how the United States effort at trying to peace build in Iraq was problematic and flawed and ultimately resulted in the problems that we've seen there. So I encourage you to watch that film.